I supported my entire family for 10 years. When I say that, I don't feel proud. I just feel tired. So tired that some mornings I sat in my car, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, no longer knowing what I was pushing myself forward for. But throughout those 10 years, no one in my family ever called it a sacrifice. They called it something else. Obligation. My family lived in Columbus, Ohio, in an old house in a middle-class neighborhood. From the outside, everything looked fine. The lawn was trimmed, the fence wasn't broken. Neighbors still exchanged polite greetings. But inside that house, everything operated on one single assumption. I would always carry the load. The mortgage, the utility bills, the sudden debts, even decisions that were never supposed to be mine to make. My name is Austin Blake, the eldest son in the family. I started working early, earning money early, and carrying responsibility earlier than anyone else. When I received my first paycheck, my mother smiled and said the family was struggling. I gave her the money. The second time, she said it was only temporary. I gave again. By the third time, no one said anything anymore. My money automatically became the family's money. No questions, no agreement. As long as I could provide, I was expected to. My father was a quiet man. He rarely opposed anything. He also never stood up for me. He just sat there in silence, as if everything unfolding was completely natural. My younger brother Kyle grew accustomed to asking. My sister Emily grew accustomed to complaining. Each of them had their own reasons for needing my money, and none of them ever thought those reasons should come to an end. The conflict didn't arrive with shouting. It arrived through accumulated exhaustion. I worked longer hours. I brought work home, carried pressure into bed, carried the numbers in my bank account into my dreams. I could no longer tell where responsibility ended and exploitation began. I only knew that if I stopped, everything would collapse. And my family constantly reminded me of that, even when they never said it out loud. Things began to change on an entirely ordinary evening. I had just finished a workday that lasted nearly 12 hours. I walked into the house completely drained. During dinner, my mother started talking about a new expense. Her voice was calm, as if it were self-evident. That night, for the first time in my life, I said I was tired. I said I wasn't sure I could keep carrying everything anymore. The dinner table fell silent. Then my mother looked at me and said a sentence I will never forget. She said, "If you can't do it anymore, what use are you?" There was no anger in her voice, only bare, cold truth. In that moment, I understood that in their eyes, my value was tied directly to my ability to provide. No more, no less. No one defended me. My father lowered his head. My brother and sister avoided my eyes. Dinner continued as if nothing had happened. But for me, something had shattered. I realized that for 10 years, I had never been seen as a complete human being in this family. I was a resource, an investment, something that only had value as long as it kept generating returns. That night, I lay awake in bed for a long time. I didn't cry. I wasn't angry either. I just felt empty. A thought appeared in my mind that I had never dared to think before. What would happen if I disappeared? Not disappearing from the world, but disappearing from the role they had assigned to me. The thought was frightening, yet strangely, it gave me the first sense of relief I had felt in many years. After that evening, no serious conversation took place. No one apologized. No one asked how I felt. Everything in the Blake household continued to operate as usual, as if that sentence had never been spoken. That silence was not peace. It was a silent agreement. I would keep carrying the burden, and they would keep treating it as a given. In the days that followed, I began to look at my family through a different lens. Not with anger, but with clarity. I noticed that every conversation, no matter how it began, eventually led back to money. My mother talked about her health, then mentioned medication costs. My brother spoke about struggles at work, then brought up a small investment. My sister complained about exhaustion, then emphasized how difficult her life was. No one explicitly said they needed money. They didn't have to. I had been trained to understand. I still went to work every day. I still transferred money on time. I still paid bills before anyone reminded me. But inside me, an invisible distance was forming. I started keeping track of small moments. Who called when they needed help? Who went silent when I didn't respond immediately? Who disappeared entirely if I said I was busy? These details were things I had never noticed before, because I had always believed that this was simply how families worked. Now, I wasn't so sure. One evening, the whole family sat down for dinner together. The atmosphere seemed normal. My mother talked about repairing the roof. My father nodded. My brother added that if it was going to be fixed, it should be done properly, once and for all. Everyone then looked at me, waiting. I asked how much it would cost. When the number was mentioned, a familiar wave of exhaustion washed over me. This time, I didn't object. I simply said I needed time to think. That sentence changed the atmosphere immediately. My mother frowned. My brother looked irritated. My sister fell silent. The idea that I needed time to think seemed unacceptable. Later that night, my mother came to me and said that the family had raised me, that it was time for me to repay them. She said it calmly, as if she were reciting a natural law. In that moment, I understood my role in this family clearly for the first time. I was not a son offering help. I was an investment reaching its collection phase. All the years I had tried, all the times I had put my own needs aside, were recorded not as love, but as obligations that were expected to continue. I began to wonder what would happen if I stopped complying. Not in a moment of anger, but through a deliberate withdrawal. The thought frightened me. I had been taught that if I didn't carry the load, the family would collapse, and that collapse would be my fault. At the same time, I realized that if I continued like this, I would collapse first. And that, no one in my family seemed to care about. In the days that followed, I tried very small changes. I didn't reply to messages immediately. I delayed a non-urgent transfer. The reaction came faster than I expected. Reminders began to appear. Then came gentle reproaches. Finally, there were moral statements. Family comes first. Blood ties cannot be abandoned. No one asked why I was slowing down. They only cared whether the flow of money was being disrupted. That night I sat alone in my room, staring at my phone screen. I reread the messages and missed calls. In all those lines of text, there was not a single one asking if I was okay. Not a single one asking what I needed. I suddenly understood that this relationship had never been mutual. I had called it family, but in reality, it operated like a dependency system, where one person gives and others take. That realization hurt, but it was also very clear. For the first time, I dared to name exactly what I was living in. And once I named it, I knew I could no longer pretend as I had before. If I was an investment, then I had the right to withdraw my capital. That thought was no longer just a question. It was beginning to turn into a plan. I didn't cut everything off immediately. I didn't get angry. I didn't make a scene. I simply began to withdraw little by little, slowly and deliberately. I wanted to see what would happen if I was no longer always available. I wanted to see how my family would react when the safety net they were used to relying on began to loosen. I moved into a small apartment on the other side of the city. Columbus isn't very large, but it's large enough to create distance. The apartment wasn't big or new, but it was mine. For the first time in many years, I had a space that wasn't tied to family responsibilities. No one there waited to ask me, "When will you transfer the money?" No one reminded me of upcoming expenses. The silence felt unfamiliar at first, but it also felt real. I began changing very specific things. I stopped co-signing loans. I no longer paid bills on behalf of others if they weren't related to me. I was no longer the first person called whenever a problem arose. These changes were necessary for me, but to my family, they felt like a wordless betrayal. My phone started ringing more often. At first, there were probing questions, then came reminders, then irritation. My mother asked if I was having some kind of problem. My brother said I was making things unnecessarily difficult. My sister said I had changed. No one asked why I needed to change. They only noticed that the familiar flow had been disrupted. One evening, my mother called me with more urgency than usual. She talked about unpaid bills, about debts that were coming due. She asked when I would help. I was silent for a few seconds, then said that this time, I couldn't. Not because I didn't have the money, but because I didn't want to continue the same way. The silence on the other end of the line lasted a long time. Then she said that I was being selfish. I didn't argue. I was used to being labeled that way. But that night, sitting alone in my new apartment, I realized that the selfishness they spoke of was simply me no longer giving unconditionally. For many years, my generosity had turned into their entitlement. When I pulled back, they called it betrayal. In the days that followed, I reduced contact even more. Not by blocking numbers or deleting names, but by not responding immediately. I left my phone on silent. I focused on my work and my own life. For the first time, I began to feel a rhythm of living that wasn't dictated by other people's needs. It was both relieving and frightening. My family wasn't used to that silence. They began calling more frequently. Messages grew longer. The tone shifted from reproach to pleading. I read everything, but I didn't reply. I wanted to see how far they would go when the familiar support was no longer there. And what I saw was that they didn't ask if I was okay. They only asked when I would return to my old role. One morning I woke up and realized that I no longer felt the same guilt as before. That feeling had followed me for years, like a tool used to keep me in place. But now, as I stepped out of that system, guilt gradually lost its weight. In its place came a clearer sense of boundaries. I began to understand that if I didn't protect myself, no one else would do it for me. I didn't know how my family was managing at that time. I didn't try to find out. The only thing I knew was that I was no longer at the center of their lives, and that made them panic. For me, it was a clear sign that my decision to withdraw was right. If my presence was measured only by what I provided, then my absence would expose that truth faster than any words could. By the end of this chapter in my life, I no longer asked myself whether I should go back or not. I only wondered why I had waited so long to withdraw my capital. When I closed the door of my apartment each night, I knew I was stepping further away from the role my family had imposed on me for 10 years. And I also knew they would not let me leave easily. A few months after I moved out, the silence between my family and me began to take on a different shape. It was no longer the underlying discomfort it once was, but a clear, heavy absence. I could sense it through the calls that were no longer constant, yet carried a new tone. Worry. My family was beginning to understand that my withdrawal was not temporary. My life had become more stable by then. I went to work, returned to my small apartment, cooked simple meals, and slept through the night. Things that seemed ordinary were once luxuries to me. I no longer woke up feeling obligated to solve other people's problems before thinking about my own. Alongside that relief, however, was a sense of caution. I knew my family would not easily accept losing the familiar source of support. Messages began to appear again, but the tone had changed. There were no direct accusations anymore. Instead, there were probing messages, attempts to reconnect. My mother asked if I had been well lately. My father messaged that he wanted to talk. My brother sent short lines asking if we could meet for coffee. If those words had come earlier, they might have softened me. Now, I read them with a new clarity. I agreed to meet them one afternoon at a cafe in the city center. I didn't choose the old house. I didn't invite them to my apartment either. I needed a neutral space, where no one held automatic authority. When I arrived, they were already seated. Looking at them, I could see a tension I had never noticed before. They were no longer certain of their position in relation to me. The conversation began slowly. My mother spoke about recent difficulties. My father nodded and added a few details. My brother stayed quiet. My sister looked down at the table. No one mentioned money directly, but it was present in every pause. I listened without interrupting. I realized they were trying a new approach, a gentler one, hoping I would willingly step back into my old role. When the conversation reached the point they had been waiting for, my mother looked at me and said the family was truly struggling. She said everyone needed me. That sentence had bound me for many years. This time, it sounded different. I no longer felt it as a natural responsibility. I heard it simply as a request. I told them that I wasn't coming back. I said I wouldn't continue providing financial support the way I had before. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't offer long explanations. I stated my boundary clearly. The air in the cafe grew heavy. My brother looked up, his expression a mix of anger and confusion. My sister bit her lip. My father stayed silent. My mother stared at me for a long time. She said I was tearing the family apart. She said I was selfish. Those words no longer made me tremble the way they once had. I heard them, recognized them as familiar, and let them pass. I understood that when a dependency system is broken, those who benefit from it will call it betrayal. That doesn't mean they are right. The meeting ended without reconciliation. I stood up first, said goodbye, and walked away. As I stepped out of the cafe, my heart was beating fast, but not from fear. It was the feeling of someone who had held a boundary through the first real test. I knew this wouldn't be the last. My family would try again, one way or another. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment, thinking about the years that had passed. I no longer asked myself whether I was wrong. I only wondered why I had accepted a role that erased me from my own life for so long. Seeing them again didn't weaken me as I had feared. Instead, it showed me that I had changed more than I realized. When I turned off the lights and lay down, I knew the relationship between my family and me would never return to what it once was. And I also knew that no longer frightened me. If they needed me to survive, they would have to learn how to survive without relying on me. As for me, for the first time, I no longer needed to prove my worth through sacrifice. After the meeting at the cafe, I didn't receive any messages for several days. This silence no longer felt probing or tense like before. It felt like a pause for calculation. I could sense it even though no one said anything. My family was facing a new reality, and they needed time to accept that I was no longer in my old position. My life continued at a steady pace. I went to work, finished my tasks on time, and came home at regular hours. I began to notice small things I had previously overlooked. Dinners uninterrupted by phone calls. Weekends no longer taken over by urgent requests. These things didn't excite me, but they gave me a sense of stability I had never experienced before. Then the calls started again. This time they weren't from my mother, but from my father. He said he just wanted to check in. His voice was low and tired. He said things at home were very difficult. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I didn't make any promises. I simply said I hoped he was well. The call ended in a heavy silence. After that came my brother. Kyle called me late one evening. He said he didn't know how to manage anymore. He said everything had changed since I left. He asked if I could help one last time. The phrase, "one last time," had appeared many times in my life. I recognized it as something people used when they wanted to pull me back without committing to change. I told him that I couldn't. I said I was no longer in that role. Kyle was silent for a long time, then said that I had changed, that I was no longer the brother I used to be. That statement didn't make me angry. It simply confirmed what I already knew. My role as a brother had been tied to providing, not to presence or affection. My mother was the last to call. She called one afternoon just after I got off work. Her voice was shakier than I remembered. She said the family truly needed me now. She said everyone was paying the price for my decision. I heard the familiar blame in her words, but also something new: fear. For the first time, she wasn't sure that I would come back. I responded slowly. I told her that I wasn't abandoning the family. I was only stepping out of the role they had grown accustomed to relying on. I said that everyone in the family was an adult and needed to take responsibility for their own lives. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't justify myself. I simply said what I had been thinking for a long time. She cried. I could hear her sobbing through the phone. For a moment, my chest tightened. Old reflexes urged me to apologize and promise help. But I didn't. I realized that if I stepped back now, everything I had built would collapse. Her pain was real, but it wasn't a reason for me to abandon myself once again. The call ended without any resolution. I put the phone down and sat still for a long time. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel completely relieved either. I just felt clear. Clear about where I stood and about what would happen if I returned to the old path. For the first time, I understood that them needing me more than I needed them was not an advantage for them. but a reality they had to face. In the days that followed, the calls became less frequent. No one tried to persuade me directly anymore. I assumed my family was learning how to survive without me at the center. For me, that was a sign that a new order was forming. I didn't know how long it would last, but I knew I wouldn't break it just to please others. When I looked back at the path I had taken, I realized that the relationship had shifted. Before, I was the one afraid of losing them. Now, they were the ones afraid of losing me. But instead of using that, I chose to keep my distance. I didn't need this new power. I only needed the freedom it gave me. I realized that the clearest change wasn't in my family, but in myself. Before, whenever my phone vibrated with a familiar number, my body reacted before my mind could catch up. My heart raced, my shoulders tensed, and a familiar sense of responsibility immediately flooded in. Now, when it happened, I simply looked at the screen and set the phone down. Not because I was indifferent, but because I had learned to distinguish between responsibility and what had gone beyond its limits. My family still tried to make contact, but no longer as aggressively as before. They shifted to other approaches. Sometimes it was messages recalling old memories. Sometimes it was subtle reminders of the past, of moments when I had said family was the most important thing. Those things once carried great weight for me. Now, I saw them as attempts to pull me back into my old role through emotion, when money was no longer an effective tool. One weekend afternoon, I agreed to meet my father, just the two of us. We sat in a small park not far from where I lived. He looked older than the last time I had seen him. He said he wasn't used to things being this difficult. He said the family was struggling. I listened, but this time, I didn't let his words guide my emotions. I understood that this wasn't a conversation between two equal people, but another attempt to pull me back into the center. My father asked whether I truly intended to abandon the family. The question was posed more like an accusation than a genuine inquiry. I replied that I wasn't abandoning anyone. I was simply no longer carrying what each person needed to carry for themselves. I said that if my family wanted to survive sustainably, they needed a new structure that didn't depend on a single person. He looked at me for a long time, but couldn't argue with what I said. After that meeting, I realized that the balance of power had truly shifted. Before, my family held power through guilt and obligation. Now, as I no longer reacted the old way, those tools lost their effectiveness. This didn't make them weak immediately, but it left them confused. They no longer knew what to say to make me return to how things were before. Meanwhile, my life continued in a different direction. I began investing time in relationships I had previously lacked the energy to maintain. I met old friends, joined simple gatherings, did things that brought no direct benefit beyond the feeling of being myself. These experiences made the difference clear between relationships built on exchange and those built on presence. My family didn't give up completely. They tried again, this time suggesting that things could return to normal if I compromised a little. They said I didn't have to carry everything, just help a bit. I listened and recognized it as the old trap, wrapped in softer language. I knew that if I accepted, every boundary I had built would collapse. I refused firmly, but without hostility. I said I wouldn't return to a structure that had drained me. I said my leaving wasn't meant to punish anyone, but to save myself. These words didn't bring reconciliation. They brought silence. But it was a different kind of silence. It was no longer silence meant to pressure me, but the silence of people beginning to understand that they no longer controlled the situation. For the first time in this process, I felt that I was no longer being pulled back and forth between two choices. I was no longer standing between my family and myself. I had chosen myself. That choice didn't come from anger or revenge, but from clarity. I knew I could help if I wanted to, but I chose not to. And that choice no longer made me question my worth. As I closed this chapter of my life, I understood that real power doesn't come from how much you give, but from your ability to stop when you need to. My family might continue to try, might continue to hope that I would soften, but I was no longer the person they once knew. And for me, that wasn't a loss, but growth. I once thought the climax of this story would be a major confrontation, a moment where emotions exploded and the truth was spoken through sharp words. But reality was different. There was no dramatic scene. The justice I experienced was a cold one, quiet, unfolding through unseen decisions and choices I no longer explained to anyone. My family began to adapt in their own way. I heard about it through fragmented updates from acquaintances. They sold some belongings. They cut expenses. My brother took on extra work. My sister moved in with a friend to reduce rent. These things could have been quickly solved in the past with a single call to me. Now, they had to manage on their own. When I learned about these changes, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel the guilt I had once expected to feel either. I simply saw a new balance forming. My family was learning a lesson they should have learned long ago. Each person is responsible for their own life. I didn't take anything away from them. I only stopped shielding them from the consequences of their own choices. One evening, my mother sent me a long message. She wrote about my childhood, about her sacrifices, about how family had once been everything to me. I read every line, recognizing the familiar tone of moral reminder. The message didn't ask for money. It asked for my return. A return without any promise of change. I didn't reply right away. I left the message there for the entire day. I thought carefully about what I wanted to say, and what I didn't want to say. I knew that if I responded emotionally, I would fall back into the old cycle. In the end, I replied with a single, short sentence. I wished her well. Nothing more. The reaction came quickly. My mother called, her voice trembling, mixed with anger and desperation. She said I was making everything cold and heartless. She said a family couldn't survive if everyone only thought of themselves. I listened, but didn't argue. I understood this was a final attempt to pull me back through guilt. When she stopped speaking, I said that I wasn't cold. I was simply no longer willing to sacrifice myself to maintain a structure that had erased me. I said that family bonds shouldn't be sustained through fear or obligation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to convince her. I just stated what I believed to be true. The call ended in heavy silence. I sat still, acutely aware of my heartbeat. I knew that after this conversation, the attempts would no longer be the same. Not because they fully understood, but because they had run out of tools. When money was gone, when guilt no longer worked, there was nothing left to pull me back. In the weeks that followed, I heard almost nothing from my family. Their absence no longer made me anxious. It felt like a quiet period marking the end of a long, tense chapter. I began to feel that I was no longer in a defensive state. I wasn't waiting for a sudden strike from the past. During that time, I looked back on the entire journey with a clarity I hadn't had before. I wasn't an abandoned victim. I was someone who had stayed too long in an unfair relationship. Leaving wasn't an act of cruelty, but a necessary correction to restore balance. Cold justice doesn't come from others apologizing or admitting fault. It comes from no longer needing those things to keep living. I didn't need my family to say they were wrong. I only needed them to stop determining my life. And when that happened, I knew I had crossed the final boundary. For a long time, I believed the most important question in this relationship was whether my family needed me or not. I spent nearly all of my adult life answering that question through action. I stayed. I carried the burden. I sacrificed. I believed that if I did enough, if I endured long enough, one day I would be seen as a son, a brother, not just a resource. But when everything gradually settled, when the calls became infrequent and the demands disappeared, I began to see the real question I needed to answer. Not whether they needed me, but whether I needed to continue living in that relationship. This shift didn't come from a dramatic moment of realization, but from prolonged quiet, where I finally had enough space to listen to myself. My life now is not perfect. I didn't suddenly become wealthy, nor did I reach a fairy tale ending. But I have things I never had before. I have time. I have energy. I have the ability to make decisions without first calculating how they will affect everyone else before thinking about myself. Those things, to me, are a different kind of wealth. At times, old memories still return. Family meals, evenings spent calculating expenses for the household, moments when I believed that if I tried just a little harder, everything would be fine. Those memories no longer hurt the way they once did. They simply remind me of where I've been and why I can't go back. I don't erase the past. I just place it where it belongs. My family still exists, in their own way. I don't know whether they are happy or not. I no longer try to find out. The distance between us is no longer an open wound, but a boundary that has been established. I haven't completely closed the door, but I'm no longer standing outside waiting either. This relationship no longer defines who I am. People sometimes ask me if I regret it. They ask with curiosity, as if expecting a story of redemption or a clear moral lesson. I usually don't answer right away. I think about everything that happened, about the years I lived in tension, about the emptiness I felt even when I was doing the right thing. And I realize that the only thing I regret is not stopping sooner. I don't see my leaving as a victory over my family. I also don't see it as a failure of family bonds. To me, it was an adjustment, a return to myself after years of living off course. I don't need anyone to admit they were wrong. I don't need an apology to keep living. I only needed the truth, and I have it now. Looking back at this story from its ending point, I understand that my disappearance forced everyone to face a question they had avoided for years. Not who could carry the load, but who was living on behalf of whom. And in this story, I had been living on behalf of many people, until I stopped. Now, if someone asks me who truly needed whom in the end, I can answer calmly. They needed me to sustain an unsustainable system. I needed to leave it in order to live as a complete human being. When I disappeared from my old role, the truth became very clear. I no longer seek validation from a place where I was measured only by what I provided. I no longer measure my worth by the extent of my sacrifice. I exist simply because I have the right to exist as myself, and that is something it took me many years to learn.